fires of frustration and discord are burning in every city. Next week, I shall ask the Congress of the United States to act, to make a commitment it has not fully made in this century to the proposition that race has no place in American life or law.
JFK became one of the first presidents to publicly state their support for civil rights legislation, and he was going to do everything in his power to pass such legislation. Unfortunately, with the death of JFK, many thought the civil rights movement would die too. Surprising to most, Kennedy's vice president, Lyndon B. Johnson, took a firm stance with civil rights activists. At a joint session of Congress, he said,
"No memorial oration or eulogy could more eloquently honor President Kennedy's memory than the earliest possible passage of the Civil Rights Bill for which he fought so long."
Johnson continued by saying, "We have talked long enough in this country about equal rights. We have talked for 100 years or more. It is now time to write the next chapter, and to write it in the books of law." Johnson's goal was to create equal rights protected by the federal government for all citizens. Although the bill had presidential backing, it still needed to be passed by Congress. The Civil Rights Bill was easily passed in the House of Representatives, but the real problem emerged upon trying to get it through the Senate. The Dixiecrat Party, which consisted of Southern Democrats, was against the bill because they opposed equal rights for all citizens. The senators in the Dixiecrat Party attempted to filibuster or talk for a long period of time in order to prevent a vote on a bill. In order to prevent this, Majority Leader Mike Mansfield convinced the Minority Leader Everett Dirksen to help the Democrats reach the two-thirds majority needed for cloture, which prevented filibustering. Senator Richard Russell of Georgia, who supported filibustering, stated, "I am proud to have been a member of that small group of determined senators that since the 9th of March has given the last iota of physical strength in the effort to hold back the overwhelming combination of forces supporting this bill until manifold evils could be laid bare before the people of the country. The people of the South are citizens of this republic. They are entitled to some consideration. It seems to me that fair men should recognize that the people of the South, too, have some rights which should be respected." Despite the efforts of the Dixiecrats, the Civil Rights Bill was passed in the Senate with 73 votes. On July 2, 1964, Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964 into law.
After the act was passed, the newly created laws were enacted throughout the country. The law gave federal government the power to prevent segregation. The most startling and impressive change was desegregation in public facilities throughout America. Restaurants, movie theaters, and many other accommodations were desegregated. To help influence the desegregation of communities, the Community Relations Service was created. Desegregation of education was enforced by the laws, too. Although they supported the desegregation, they had a hard time upholding the rules. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 contained a section regarding the workforce. In this section, the act stated that employment must not be discriminated based upon race or gender. The Civil Rights Law created the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission to make sure jobs were not discriminated against based on race, gender, and nationality. The law gave the United States Attorney General more power in bringing up lawsuits upon schools and employers who practice segregation. Although the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was effective, it did not enforce the 15th Amendment. The 15th Amendment prohibits the government from denying male citizens the right to vote. Many Southern African Americans were not registered to vote and were denied their rights to vote. Specifically, in Selma, Alabama, Jim Clark, the sheriff, ordered armed whites to make sure no African Americans could register to vote. Also, his armed men terrorized blacks and attacked them. During one of Martin Luther King's speeches, Clark and his men arrested 2,000 African Americans and brutally beat many more. In response to Clark's actions, the quest for voting rights began with the Selma March on March 7, 1965. The 54-mile march from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama included 500 protesters, including the leader Martin Luther King Jr., the SCLC's Hosea Williams, and the NCC's John Lewis. The march was encountered with violence at the end of the Edmond Pettus Bridge.
In about a minute and a half, Major John Cloud said, "Troopers, advance."
Advance toward the group. See that they turn around and disperse.
You saw these men putting on their gas masks. They came toward us. Beating us with nightsticks and bullwhips, shrimping us with horses, releasing the tear gas.
A total of 70 African Americans were wounded and hospitalized, while many more were injured. This event, known as Bloody Sunday, influenced President Johnson to provide Congress with legislation for civil rights 8 days later.
Lyndon Johnson spoke to a joint session of the Congress as he spoke to the nation. He started that speech off that night by saying, "I speak tonight for the dignity of man and for the
destiny of democracy." At times, history and fate meet at a single time, in a single place, to shape a turning point in man's unending search for freedom. So it was last week in Selma, Alabama. The harsh fact is that in many places in this country, men and women are kept from voting simply because they are Negroes. Their cause must be our cause too, because it's not just Negroes, but really it's all of us who must overcome the crippling legacy of bigotry and injustice. And we shall overcome.
On August 3rd and 4th, 1965, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed through the House of Representatives and the Senate. The act mandated federal examiners who would participate in the registering of African Americans. It also banned discriminatory devices such as literary tests and racial gerrymandering. The Civil Rights and Voting Act provide the legacy that the President, Congress, and Supreme Court all work together to protect the rights of citizens.